Like him or loathe him, there's no denying that Joe Brolly does good drama. For years, he delighted or infuriated sports fans with his boisterous contributions as a pundit on RTE Television's The Sunday Game. Now, I'm fairly clueless about the world of GAA, but even I know how he ruffled feathers with his forthright views and often blunt delivery. He's not all that different in a courtroom. A well-respected barrister, Brolly has been representing Adrian Holland since shortly after he was first charged in April 2020 with being involved in the murder of Robbie Lawlor. In Belfast's Magistrates Court, Brolly painted a vivid picture of how Holland's defence team believe the assassination was carried out. It raised some interesting questions about how the investigation has been handled. During a bail hearing, one of many that both Holland and his alleged accomplice Patrick Tier were refused, the barrister told the court that his client was an innocent mug. With his customary theatrical flair, Brolly declared, "I smell a rat in this case. I've smelt a rat from the outset." He then laid out the background of Lawler's murder, how it was planned and how it went down. The court was told that Lawler is believed to have shot and paralysed Owen Maguire, one of the leading figures in the Drogheda feud, and how he was also suspected of killing teenager Cian Mulready Woods. This feud in Louth and the death of Mulready Woods directly led to Lawler's assassination. A three-man cell, Brolly claimed, which included the gunman and getaway driver, were in Belfast the day before Lawler was shot, planning and organising the hit. This, he said, included a meeting at Tesco car park and scouting out a flat on University Road where Lawler had been staying, all of which was caught on CCTV. And Brolly detailed how these three men were arrested as they left Belfast after the murder and taken in for questioning, but that then they were released. The three people believed to be the assassination team have been allowed to leave the jurisdiction, Brolly claimed. They have never been subject to any follow-up investigation, and they have been airbrushed from the papers. He also told the court that shortly after the killing, two women believed to be linked to the McCarthy Dundon gang were allegedly caught with €50,000 in cash, which he described as blood money payment. Referring to his client, Joe Brolly questioned why Ado Holland would have got involved in an attack at his own home and then remained there after the murder was done. "There's a fundamental flaw at the heart of this investigation," he submitted. It's an ongoing court case, one that's not expected to come to an end anytime soon, so we're restricted in what more we can say. But because Joe Brolly stood up in open court and submitted exactly how Holland's defence team allege Robbie Lawlor was murdered, we can repeat what he has said. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Double Cross, the Murder of Robbie Lawlor, a Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal. We know who the three-man cell was. In fact, it's more like a 2.5-man cell with Quincy Bramble, Ger Dundon, and his then 17-year-old nephew, Levi Killeen. They were picked up and arrested just hours after Robbie Lawlor was killed, but after being questioned, they were released, and the PSNI have since said they don't believe they had any involvement in the murder.
The gunmen who have been named in court again by Joe Brolly have not even been arrested and questioned formally about this. We know that they were stopped on the day of the killing, but they were released without charge. They were then involved in another very serious incident, some of them over in England. The questions have been asked, I suppose, by Holland and Tier's legal team is why, when they were in prison in England and therefore, again, a captive audience, you didn't need to go look at them. They were there on remand awaiting trial for something else. Were they not questioned then? There seems to be no effort to question the people, and there has been nothing said by the prosecution to date. And remember, we're still a bit off getting a trial date set for this. There's been nothing to say to date who they actually think the gunmen are. The prosecution have only ever defended themselves in bail hearings by saying, you know, we believe that this person can't be trusted to go on bail. He would be a flight risk. He would be a danger in the community because of the amount of publicity around this case. But they haven't actually laid out the sequence of what they believe yet to have actually happened. They've said who they know wasn't the gunman, but they've yet to say who was. I mean, we're sitting here, we're not detectives, but clearly it's easily pieced together that these figures were responsible. Is it to say that police don't believe that Adrian Hall and Patrick Tier had some role in terms of the organisation of this? Well, clearly it happened in Adrian Holland's granny's house. You know, the poor granny, God rest her, this lovely, good-living woman who spent a lot of her time sitting in Holy Cross Church praying, and her house becomes the centre of one of the biggest crime stories in Ireland. But even from what has been read out in court during the bail hearings that's been said at the interviews, even the police don't believe that Adrian Holland is a big bad boy gangster assassin. Nobody does. But we do know who are big bad boy gangster assassins, and yet none of them are charged.
In the weeks after Robbie Lawlor was killed, one thing that became indisputably clear was the connection between Ger Dundon and Cornelius Price. After being released by the PSNI, Dundon headed to England, where we know he got stuck into chasing debts owed to drug dealers like Warren Crossan. Cornelius Price had been living over there since the murder of Cian Mulready Woods. The grisly killing of the teenager had caused massive public outrage and highlighted the feud that had paralysed Drogheda for the previous few years. The intense attention and Garda crackdown on illegal activity in the town made it too difficult for Price to carry on with his business. That Dundon teamed up with Price in the UK was an interesting development in this whole saga. It wasn't all that long since Ger Dundon had been acting as Robbie Lawler's protector, making sure that Price and his associates couldn't get to him.
So in October 2018, at this stage, Robbie Lawler was facing charges, but Cornelius Price was imprisoned for driving a car at a guard. This is in the aftermath of Richie Carberry's murder. Cornelius Price conducted what's known as a Judas handshake. Basically, he had arranged to talk to Robbie Lawler. He went up to shake his hand. I think there was discussions that this would bring a feud to the end because they're both in this sort of confined prison. As he went up to Robbie Lawler, he shook his hand, but he held him in position, and two other inmates came out of nowhere, and Robbie Lawler was slashed. Ultimately, he needed 29 stitches, but wasn't seriously injured in terms of being brought to hospital or anything. And that's what's known as a Judas handshake.
The betrayal.
The betrayal.
So where does Ger Dundon come in? After this, Lawler is in a weakened position in prison. He's been attacked, he's been injured. He needs protection. He
needs protection, and Ger Dundon had offered to provide that protection. Ger Dundon obviously would have had this huge network, not just through the Limerick criminals, but he also had been very close at times to members of the Kinnan cartel and also some of the other gangs scattered around the country. And having him in your camp would have provided Lawler with that protection. At this stage, he had so many enemies from so many places, and Dundon would have been somebody that would have provided him with, if you want to get at Lawler, you have to come through me.
A friend or a business deal?
Probably a bit of both. A business deal for sure. And that was one of the things that the Dundon McCarthy's specialised in. Ger Dundon had previously provided protection for John Gilligan when he had fallen foul of the Kinnan cartel. He'd been paid for doing so, but he'd also provided him for protection when he got out of jail after a couple of serious attempts on his life.
Anyone with a decent knowledge of the history of Ger Dundon's criminal career shouldn't be all that surprised at the possibility of him flipping from protector to assassinator. Indeed, it's worth taking a quick look back at the reasons for his family's notorious reputation. When you think of the Dundons, the McCarthy-Dundon gang, you just think of double cross, because famously that's really how they came on our radar. And it was to do with the Keane family and a very intricate plan that ultimately turned on Ciarán Keane.
Ultimately, the feud in Limerick became known as the McCarthy-Dundons against the Keane Colopes, but it wasn't always so clear. The Ryan faction were one of the original criminal gangs, and the Dundons were seen as being slightly outside, even though they were related to some of the McCarthy gang members.
So central to this double cross were two brothers, the Ryans, Kieran, Rasher's Ryan and Ed's Ryan.
Yeah, so their father, Eddie Ryan Sr., had been murdered in the Moose Bar in 2000, and that had sparked a lot of the feuding that occurred in Limerick. And at that time, things were very tense. The Ryan and the Keane clans were in direct conflict. And in the middle of all this, there was this reported abduction of the two brothers, Kieran and Eddie Ryan, Kieran better known as Rashers. The word that got out to the Gardaí that they had been abducted. Now, ultimately, it is believed that they faked their own abduction. In the middle of all that, the Dundons became involved. They had made contact with the Keanes, who they had dealt with before, even though they ultimately will become mortal enemies. And they offered to show Owen Tracy and Kieran Keane Sr. The dead bodies of the Ryan brothers. The Keanes had no knowledge at all that this abduction was fake, basically. So Owen Tracy and Kieran Keane Sr. Kieran Keane Sr. was probably one of the heads of the Keane faction. They were lured to a lane with the belief that they were going to see the dead bodies of these two brothers. And when they got there, Kieran Keane was brutally murdered. Owen Tracy was stabbed a huge number of times and amazingly survived with his life. And though that double cross murder would be one of the most significant moments in that feud for a number of reasons. Certainly the murder of Kieran Keane was hugely traumatic for Christy Keane Sr., who would take up the mantle of the war, but it would also lead to a number of senior members of the McCarthy Dundon gang ending up serving life imprisonment, including Desi Dundon. Desi Dundon, the brother of Wayne and John, in some ways maybe less well known, but ultimately regarded as being one of the most notorious and devious criminal figures ever to operate in Ireland's criminal underworld.
In May 2024, at Wood Green Crown Court in London, Ger Dundon was jailed for a total of 15 years. He got 10 for his role in the violent abduction of two brothers in a bid to extort more than £300,000. The trial heard that Dundon, whose official name is now Darren McLean, had threatened to shoot two dudes in the head if the money was not paid. He was handed down another 5 years for other unrelated offences, including a firearms charge. Sentencing Dundon Judge John Dodds recommended that he serve at least half of the sentence before he could be considered for release. The senior investigating officer on the case told the court how the abduction of the two brothers had been a terrifying experience for the victims. It also had a profound impact on their family members and friends. The investigation was incredibly complex. We're pleased that McLean will now be serving a substantial sentence which reflects the seriousness of this disturbing crime. 5 other people had been arrested and charged with offences linked to the kidnapping. They also went on trial but were found not guilty. At least we know where Dundon will be for the next few years. Up until last summer, the only people facing trial for the murder of Robbie Lawlor were Ado Holland and Patrick Tier. Then in mid-June, the third man, Jim Fields, was charged with assisting offenders. It's thought the entire trial could now be delayed until at least 2025 or beyond, since the Public Prosecution Service have added that third defendant to the case.
Paddy Tier is a friend of Adrian Holland.
This is Kieran Shields. He's a partner at the law firm Madden and Finucane, and he also represents Adrian Holland.
Both men were from North Belfast. Adrian Holland came to know Robbie Lawler, I think about six or 7 weeks before he died. It's fair to say that Adrian would have been known to police. It's also fair to say he's not known to police for violence. They had been put in touch with each other, I believe, via a mutual acquaintance called Warren Crossan, who's now deceased. He was shot dead a couple of months after Robbie Lawler. My understanding is that Lawler was under heavy threat in the south, arising out of his alleged involvement in the Keane Mulready Woods killing and other incidents, I think, in which he was involved in a serious dispute with members of the Maguire faction prison. I think he moved to Belfast really out of safety. I think he was a fairly lonely figure and an isolated figure in the south. Became involved with Adrian Holland in the buying and selling of cars, bringing cars up from the south. And Holland involved Tier, because Tier was a mechanic, was involved in getting those cars ready for sale, looking at them to see whether they were roadworthy, what a proper price for them would be. But certainly the relationship was all around cars. Adrian would say that Robbie Lawler treated him well. He paid him well. You could see from the text messages, the various messages that have been collated by police, that their interaction with each other could be quite fractious. I don't know. It seemed to me that Adrian was being pushed constantly by pushed and tested by Lawler. He would give him an insult and then tell him he was great. That type of thing. My impression of it would have been that Adrian Holland would have known he's not a man to cross. The last time Adrian had seen him alive was on a Friday night at the Crumlin Tesco's car park where they met. They were supposed to sell a car towards the end of that week. It never came off. Adrian's aunt was dying of COVID. They had agreed that they would just come back on Monday and start again in relation to the vehicles that they had to sell. But things had been left between them that they wouldn't see each other again until Monday morning.
Holland and Tier's legal teams had to try on a number of occasions to get them bail before they were granted their freedom. At one point in February 2022, they sought to have their prosecutions halted altogether after making allegations of eavesdropping on conversations between the two men and their lawyers.
On the 14th of January, Friday the 14th of January 2022, I got a phone call from I would have often spoke to him late on a Friday afternoon. At that stage, he would have had his phone and he was on a good regime in the prison. He would have been looked on as a prisoner of influence. Yeah. There were no prison visits going on either. Everything was by Zoom. There's no face-to-face visits going on. But the telephone conference went on from 16:30 to about 16:42 was the first bit, and then the phone dropped. But I hadn't hung up. And Eddie hadn't hung up either. But I can't ring him. He must ring me. Yeah. So he has a digit code to access his account where he'll have credit on it. I could hear, the do, as he's typing away, and then he starts to type in my phone number. But I'm sitting hearing all this. And then could hear two voices talking, and he said, "Well, that's them back on here now." And Eddie says to me, "Q, did you hear that?" And I said, "Yeah, that's us back on now. Do you want to join in?" And you can hear us shuffling about, and Eddie starts going, "Did you hear them? Did you hear?" Very excitedly, "Did you hear them?" I said, "Yeah, they got it." And he's all, "They've done this a couple of days ago too. Because Eddie had been on a Zoom visit with his partner, and this sign came on. It was like a notification during the Zoom that they were being monitored, and Eddie had seen this, got a bit incensed because this was happening all the time, and it got to the stage that every time it would come on, his partner Orla would screenshot it. So of a whole litany of screenshots, with when their visits were being viewed, and Eddie had on his way from the Zoom area in the prison, he had seen a door to a room opened, and he was trying to get speaking to an SO, or senior officer in the prison, and he banged on the door and he opened it, and he says there was a whole array of TV screens. They have to monitor that to see, for example, has somebody come on the Zoom who shouldn't be on it. For example, say somebody has turned up in the room with the girlfriend, or who shouldn't have never been on that visit. And we get all that totally. Yes, but the point is Eddie raised it as a formal complaint, and the governor came back and gave him an apology in writing, saying that shouldn't have happened. and it won't happen again. But a couple of days later, not only did it happen again, this time it happened with a solicitor. And it clearly happened in a way that wasn't just accidentally the prison listening to a family visit that it's not really within the rules that you do that. And if there's any suggestion that somebody's using the facility to break the law, well, there's legislation for that. It's called RIPA. And on many occasions, RIPA warrants have been obtained for perfectly lawful reasons and it's a law enforcement tool that it should be used so that serious crime can be, like conspiracies to murder, for example, have been detected on foot of RIPA warrants. But it's a different situation. This was just something that had been used, and it was suspected it was happening on a blanket basis by a security department within Maghaberry Jail, which is out of control, which is doing what it wants. There's no RIPA warrant that I believe that was in place for the conversation, that we heard, that's them back on now.
This is a matter of the gravest significance, Brolly said. It's quite clear we are not going to be able to consult with the accused. God only knows what they have listened to and what information has been passed on. And he went on, we'll be making an abuse of process application to stop the prosecution altogether. This is a fundamental building block of our jurisprudence. Where someone is in custody is a most serious case like this. The state must guarantee confidentiality. Patrick Tyr's barrister, Sean Devine, was equally outraged. It's very difficult to respond to what has been outlined with anything other than anger, he said. It's the stuff of nightmares, quite frankly. District Judge George Connor did not take the matter lightly. You've raised significant issues which will have to be addressed in due course, he told them. It's not just in Northern Ireland the questions have been raised about the behaviour and tradecraft of the police force. Interestingly, it was at the trial of Gerry Hutch, who we know as the Monk, where we got a good glimpse of how intensely secretive the world of the Garda National Surveillance Unit, the NSU, can be. Tasked with intelligence gathering and surveillance operations, it's thought there are about 100 specially trained and selected detective Gardaí in the unit. Plain clothed and armed with guns, it's a covert, shadowy arm of the force, and for good reason. They deal with the most serious crime that threatens the safety of the citizens of this country, including terrorist threats. The NSU was responsible for bugging the car that carried Gerry Hutch and former Sinn Féin councillor Jonathan Dowdall across the border to meet with members of the IRA. Their taped conversations were an integral part of the case against them. But just days into the trial, it emerged that the records from the tracking device had been destroyed on instructions of the then head of the NSU. It was also signed off by an assistant commissioner. When quizzed about the decision, the Gardaí said they were deleted because of their policy that all surveillance data older than 3 years should be destroyed if it's not required for prosecution or for appeal. Gerry Hutch's barrister, Brendan Grehan, told the Special Criminal Court that he couldn't understand how Gardaí could, in good faith, decide to destroy the records, and he suggested some sort of cleaning house had taken place. He described it as disturbing and a real problem. Indeed, the loss of those records threatened to derail the entire trial. But then, lo and behold, a few days later, the prosecuting counsel was able to declare what was lost has now been found. In a stroke of exceptional good luck, cyber specialists had located the information on a desktop computer that had been earmarked for destruction. It was a bizarre turn of events, and several theories circulated as to why they might have been misplaced, including the fact the majority of the recordings had been taped when Hutch and Dowdall had crossed the border into another police jurisdiction. It was thought that because of that, they might not be admissible as evidence. However, in the end, the judges ruled otherwise. While the trial was saved, it has left in its wake a certain level of controversy over how the NSU conducts itself. And there's no doubt there's a lot more scrutiny of what cases they're possibly involved in, including the Robbie Lawlor murder investigation. When we talk about this, what happened behind the scenes that day that Robbie Lawlor died, what happened about Ger Dundon, Quincy Bramble and Levi Killeen being arrested and later released, or very quickly released really.
Yeah.
We have to kind of bear in mind, I suppose, we just don't know and never will get the detail of what was passed between the Irish Gardaí and the PSNI.
So if you look at the PSNI and the Gardaí have had a really good working relationship. I mean, there's no doubt about that. While there was a lot of tensions at times between the RUC and the Gardaí in the Troubles era, there's still, even back then, there was a good exchange of information. However, it's just not as simple as the fact they can log on to each other's computer system and see what the other have. They rely on points of contact, people to share information. We know that people were moving across the borders. There was presumably digital communications. There was presumably both police forces had some sort of human intelligence as well. So we know that there was a degree of communication. But what exactly was being shared, certainly at the moment and even in the aftermath, nobody can know.
Well, I recall, because I went up there, and obviously I don't have great sources in the north, but I have pretty good sources in the south. And I recall being shocked when Dundon, Bramble and Killeen were released, because when I heard they were arrested, it just seemed such a classic Dundon move, the double cross. They were with him. I was aware that Ger Dundon and Robbie Lawlor were friends, but, you know, in that world, who is your friend and who is your enemy? And especially when somebody's under threat, you know, being close to them, being within their inner circle is a very powerful place to be. So it was like, okay, so they had nothing to do with it, yet they coincidentally end up being with Robbie Lawlor. But there clearly was some information that went from the south to the north that resulted in the release of Ger Dundon, Quincy Bramble and Levi Killeen. And Levi Killeen unconditionally, I think, because of his age. In other words, they never wanted to speak to him again. And they got in their cars and they drove over the border. They got away from it. And at that point, you had to be of the belief that the information going south to north was that Ger Dundon and Robbie Lawlor are colleagues, comrades, friends.
Look, we'll never know, because that communication will never become public, no matter what court cases go ahead. But it seems that there was a belief that Ger Dundon was an ally of Robbie Lawlor, and that could be taken as trust, or on trust that he wasn't involved, which seems unusual, because all of the Dundon brothers have at times manipulated, double-crossed, backstabbed and become involved in violence in deceitful and manipulative ways. Ger Dundon being amongst them as well.
But you felt like shouting, do you not know what these guys are like? These guys can double-cross and can't be trusted. The Dundon gang in particular cannot be trusted by anyone. And of course what happened in the aftermath really sort of dug that, you know, that narrative in, that of course they can't be trusted. You know, a couple of days later, the National Surveillance Unit are watching members of their grouping pick up what looks like a bounty that was on Robbie Lawlor's head. But at the same time all that was going on, there was a clear name coming into the mix of having organised the murder of Robbie Lawlor from very early on, and that was Mr. Big. That name was being put about that day within hours of his murder. Okay, we all knew that Mr. Big and Robbie Lawlor were sworn enemies. The Cian Mulready Wood situation that had happened, like those parts of his body were left in Mr. Big's territory. It was a message to Mr. Big and his young underlings who had taken on Robbie Lawlor outside that gym. So, you know, it's natural that that's going to be there. Whenever somebody in gangland is murdered, you know, there's a kind of a who's who of their enemies are lined up as possible suspects. Obviously that Mr. Big name was very much there in that mix, as was Cornelius Price, as was obviously Owen Maguire and others that had beef with Robbie Lawlor. But it was just so strange the way the Dundons were with them, they were arrested and bump, they're gone off the radar so quick.
Yeah, it was amazing because when they were arrested, when Ger Dundon was arrested in the immediate aftermath, you instantly think the case is effectively solved straight away. Now, we know because of what happened in the future that Cornelius Price, who was really the number one enemy of Robbie Lawlor in many ways, we know that he was close to Ger Dundon. Ger Dundon would ultimately end up over in England, involved in another criminal conspiracy with Cornelius Price. So the reality of the links between them were there and were obvious. So it was surprising. Obviously, Mr. Big, his enmity with Robbie Lawlor was well established, particularly by the murder of Ken Finn. Mr. Big has tentacles all over Ireland.
And very much into the north, and he would have had a lot of associates who were up along the border into the north. He had become big at this stage, literally, because of the demise of the Kinahan organisation. He had really grown his outfit. He was well capable of this. And his name never really left the mix.
No.
Even though there was never any clear evidence of why he was involved.
No, I mean, the evidence, there was no clear evidence in terms of why he was involved, but it was well known the influence he had over criminals operating across the north, particularly in the border area, but stretching up to Belfast. While the Kinahans had really controlled Dublin and other parts of the country, Mr. Biggs certainly for the last decade had made criminal ties with a lot of these people up towards even the north part of Leinster and Louth, and that's why he was a player in the Drogheda feud. He had been supplying gangs. He had had criminal associations with the Maguire and Cornelius Price faction. So his name was straight away put into the mix. It was always put forward that it wasn't just a single person who had targeted Robbie Lawlor, that it had been a joint operation really between a number of criminal organisations who all had Lawlor in their sights, and all who feared that Lawlor had them in his sights as well.
It was really when the bail application, Adrian Holland's bail application was made, and the PSNI gave some evidence to the court, and they suggested this meeting with Holland and an international crime boss based in Sligo, who we immediately know is Barry Young. Of course, Barry Young is facing his own problems. He is facing a charge for directing a criminal organisation. He is caught with a phone with a huge amount of messages on them over the years in the aftermath of Robbie Lawlor's murder. But he's also somebody who's always said to be afraid of Mr. Big and to be controlled, directed by Mr. Big. So all of a sudden, this web of betrayal is getting even bigger. And while the Dundons never fully leave my mind as part of this, you do have to wonder, was the double cross, were they somehow involved in setting up Robbie Lawlor, or did they double cross others with an opportunism to make money?
I mean, the Dundons are notorious for opportunism, so that has to have been at the forefront of people's minds, because obviously in the immediate aftermath of Robbie Lawlor's murder, 2 women are arrested, collecting €50,000 at a service station in the Midlands. It was obviously an intelligence-led operation. The Gardaí knew exactly what was about to happen. You can see that they spring on it. These women are taken in, and they include Ciara Lynch, who's the long-term girlfriend of Desi Dundon, one of the Dundon brothers. So she collects this money. Ultimately, she pleads guilty, so the guards don't have to go to court and describe what it was for. But we know it was part of an operation that was looking at all these criminal figures. Certainly at the time, there was the belief that was that was paid by the Maguire faction as a payment for the murder of Robbie Lawlor. But Mr. Big is absolutely there in the background, and there's always this word on the street that he was at the very least pulling the strings. Barry Young, who was a very significant criminal figure in his own right and controlled a network, I think during his trial it said of up to 30 people worked for him. He certainly operated in the Sligo area, but he also operated through the north. But again, while we did hear in that trial about Barry Young being in fear of people above him and of him not being at the top of this criminal pyramid, I think it's described as, Mr. Big's name is never brought in there. There's none of that evidence is admitted, but always the word from people in the criminal underworld, from other sources, is that behind all of these people, behind Cornelius Price, behind Barry Young, behind people in the north, there is this shadowy figure known as Mr. Big, who is pulling all these strings and connecting all of these dots that ultimately led to the murder of Robbie Lawlor.
And I suppose we need to, where we are when it comes to this murder. There's 3 people before the courts. The trials are not imminent in the north because of other evidence that's still to come before the court. And I think they're still building their defence. But nonetheless, the PSNI have said 20 people were involved in this murder up to. Where are the rest? Why have there been no charges made? And really, if we look again to that very confident release of Dundon, Bramble and Killeen, hours after Robbie Lawlor's murder, it was easy to jump to a conclusion that those 3 were involved, had carried it out perhaps. But what we didn't know at that point, and what we do know now, was that both the PSNI and the Garda Síochána were up live listening to, in on and watching messages going between criminals on the Encrochat network. The criminals didn't know it at that stage, but to me, the secrets of exactly what happened here and who double-crossed who have to lie within those Encrochat messages. The killing of Robbie Lawlor brought to a close one of the more unsavoury and violent episodes of Gangland Ireland. It's hard to think that many will mourn him, apart, of course, from his own immediate family. And we should remember he left behind 3 young children. The events surrounding his death and the ongoing investigation have also trained a spotlight on the crime scene in the north, one that we in the Republic were not all that familiar with. Does his foray across the border prove that in fact there are no borders when it comes to serious crime? Are our gangsters in the north so ruthlessly determined that no one steps onto their turf without their say, so that the killing was meant as a message for others who might dare to follow him up? The Encrochat phone hack, which went live just days before Robbie Lawlor's death, has probably been the clearest window into the workings of the underworld that law enforcement has ever had. Over an almost 3-month period, officers had a front row seat at the telephone exchange of gangland's most prolific, who were ordering drugs, weapons and even murders as casually as ringing a local takeaway, while sharing pictures of their pets, their cars and even their feet. Hundreds of kingpins, corrupt police officers and seemingly ordinary business people have been caught up in the huge dragnet that followed. Their lifestyles and business dealings played out in a way never seen before and in what they believed was a totally bulletproof method of communications. By the time the Encrochat platform messaged users urging them to get rid of their handsets after realising it had been compromised by law enforcement, it was June 2020 and Robbie Lawlor had been laid to rest near the grave of his brother-in-law Richie Carberry at Laytown Cemetery. More than 115 million criminal conversations had at that point been intercepted through the hacking of over 60,000 users. Chats about blood and about betrayal. And the question now remains, are the secrets of Robbie Lawlor's murder hidden within those messages? And will they ever be brought before the courts? You've been listening to Double Cross, the Murder of Robbie Lawlor. This podcast is produced by Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini for Crime World Presents. Claude Amini and Alison Morris are assistant producers. The script is by Jane Finnegan. Graphics are by Enda Bulger. This podcast is based on the book Web of Betrayal by me, Nicola Tallant. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.